This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Lager yeast and the evolution of expression in lager fermentation is the subject of today's Spotlight podcast, brought to you interruption-free by the experts at Fermentis. They've been experts in fermentation for over 160 years, and of course, brewers everywhere depend on Fermentis for yeast that's consistent, controllable, and high quality, whether you're brewing an ester-forward Belgian-style beer, your favorite IPA, or a clean lager. Through today's episode, we're going to focus on an evolving subject, one that we've covered in our latest issue, our lager issue of Craft Beer and Brewing. That's lager yeast that's focused more on character than cleanliness. I think we're in this evolutionary phase of lager brewing in America and I think it all really tracks back to the pandemic, where brewers had some more tank time, more time to focus on projects that they may have not otherwise focused on. We just saw this huge leap in lager brewing happen. And, I think we're at this point, broadly speaking, where brewers are looking to move past that kind of reductive idea of lager brewing as creating only crispy or hyper clean or minimal kinds of beers. And, we're hearing more and more brewers talk about finding expression in lager yeast and in brewing with lager yeast. And of course, you've got folks like Bob that have been taking lager yeast and making IPAs, and this intersection, not just IPAs, but IPAs, West Coast Pilsners, and more hop-focused beers. And there's a lot of potential, and there's a whole family of lager yeasts that that Urs can speak to on this episode. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Anyway, there's lots of potential here for lager yeast beyond just the typical stereotypical ideas that a lot of American brewers have around lager yeast. And so to get to this point, to have build a conversation about that, we've pulled together some phenomenal people for the conversation. And, first as Urs Wellhoener, the technical director and brewing R&D for Boston Beer. Welcome to the podcast, Urs.
Thanks for having me.
Also joining us is Grant Lawrence. He's a former professional brewer, an active home brewer, and the Southwestern sales rep for Fermentis. Welcome to the podcast, Grant.
Yeah, good to be here. Excited. One of my favorite topics.
And then, of course, the podcast wouldn't be complete without an old standby favorite of the Craft Beer and Brewing podcast, Bob Kunz, founder of Highland Park Brewing in Los Angeles. Bob has joined us in the past for discussions about Highland Park, as well as a panel discussion on a West Coast Pilsner a couple years ago. Welcome back to the podcast, Bob.
Thanks for having me. Topic I'm pumped to talk about.
One of the most cerebral and thoughtful, philosophical brewers I know, Bob, and always enjoy those conversations. So we're going to dive into the subject, but maybe we, kick off first with a little bit of background. Grant, why don't you give us a little bit of your background and history?
Sure, Jamie. As you mentioned, like most of us in this industry, I got started homebrewing in the mid 2000s, and that kind of led to a master's degree in food science, and then from there went on to brew professionally for a number of years at St. Arnold Brewing here in Houston, Texas, where I live. And and then from there went on to work for Great Western Malting for about 7 years, and now I've been with Fermentis for about a year and a half. So that's kind of my beer journey, about a decade in the industry, and just as passionate as ever, and huge fan of lagers.
I love that you still actively homebrew, just to get your brewing fix, even though you're not doing it on a day-to-day basis as a pro brewer these days.
That's right. Yeah, it's fun. I mostly brew lagers. And then it's neat getting to test out all the malt and hops and things like that. I've been able to kind of get my hands on early over the years on that side.
Sure. Bob, I know we've heard your bio before, but maybe for those folks that are tuning in for the first time, give us the nutshell of you and Highland Park.
Yeah, well, I'm the owner-operator of Highland Park Brewery. We're kind of smack dab in the city of Los Angeles. For me, and I think our team here at Highland Park, I would say I've got a lifelong pursuit of flavor exploration. I love fermentation. I'm highly curious, but I'm also highly, I would say, focused on evolution and innovation and things sort of like moving forward. So I would say at Highland Park Brewery, that's in our ethos is sort of like exploration and curiosity and thinking about how what we're fermenting is moving with the modern world.
I think it's hard to understate just how influential Highland Park has been in terms of helping other brewers, inspire other brewers to also pick up the idea of hoppy beers with lager yeast, and and you can kind of trace back some of these influence. And of course, Highland Park has just been a major influence now on the entire world of brewing around that. And so it's cool to get this perspective. Urs, you've got a really interesting history and background where your family, you were a third generation yeast scientist, and your father and grandfather have all done important work in the space of brewing yeast. I'm fascinated by this story. Can you share that with us?
Well, it's a pretty long story, Actually, yeah, third generation brewer, and I actually became a brewer because of my family, and I explored some other avenues like the steel industry in my hometown, but never got me more fascinated than the brewing. And I was doing the jobs in spring and summer, during the school break, where I worked in cleaning tanks and packaging kegs, and you remember all the old days back in the 80s, and got me so fascinated. And it was all like this. This is the only job where you can have beer at work. And that was, and it was all much cleaner and all that. And that's where I decided I will continue the brewing. My grandfather was quite a popular person and scientist. He had his own institute. And if you remember about pressure fermentation, that made him pretty famous back then. He was implementing that internationally first, and then into a couple of German breweries, and very successful with that. And then he also was a scientist. He had his own institute with his own yeast strains. That is now transferred over to Germany in the 80s as well. So, and now Germany has basically all of these Wellhoener strains from my grandfather. And my dad, he was the brewery manager at the Kölsch brewery in Cologne, close to Cologne, that where I grew up, and so basically I'm a Kölsch guy in first place. So after I finished my high school in Germany, then I started my apprenticeship at the brewer in Münster, in a smaller brewery. We had about 12,000 hectoliters. That would be 11,000 barrels, 10,000, something like that. And actually I wasn't working for my dad's brewery. I was really away from home and was learning the craftsmanship, because we had the old autobiometric fillings of cakes, and not the cakes we know today. So it was different, very handcrafted. And so after 2 years, so I finished my apprenticeship, and then I went to Weinstoffen, graduated there as a brewing engineer, then went back into the industry, and then I was working for an out brewery in Germany called Fermentis. I'm not sure if you know the brewery Fermentis. And then I worked there for 2 years on a yeast project. Then I went back to Weinstoffen, decided to pursue my PhD, and it was about yeast again. And then I also was a quality manager at the same time for a smaller brewery in Bavaria, because we didn't make enough money as a PhD candidate, and so we have to do some additional work. And then what finished 2006, I was also teaching students, that was great. That was a great experience. That's why I have a great network with all my former students. So pretty cool. And then, then I was sort of like a crossing path where I decided what I'm doing next. I would love to stay at the university, but I also wanted to be in the industry. And I knew the people from Boston Beer, from a couple of presentations, and then they were asked me if I would like to join them as the yeast expert. And I never thought about going to the US at that point. And then I thought, a year or two and then going back to Germany. And now I'm here for 17 years with our beer company. So, and I love it. It's great. There's a lot of things there because with the German, with the purity law and all of this, I'm a fan of it, but I'm not 100% behind that one because anything that is natural, that should be applied in brewing, but anything that is cheating, that should be not applied in brewing. That is my mantra with regard to purity law.
Sure, and I think there's, given these Wellhoener yeasts that you talk about, that even your grandfather had, isolated and propped up, there's a interesting potential in those. And, in some of the articles that I read in doing some research for this episode, you've even talked about some of the potential that those have in interacting with hops in a more favorable, interesting way than maybe some other lager yeasts traditionally or historically have. And so I think it's fascinating. It's going to be interesting to kind of dive in on this topic and understand how that intersection goes, especially given just how many brewers are making hoppy beers, hop forward, whether those are West Coast style Pilsners or whether those are Italian style Pilsners, or whether those are even straight up IPAs. Bob, let's maybe kick off the conversation with you and kind of explain where you have, moved over the last 7-8 years in terms of thinking about how you use lager yeast to achieve the kinds of fermentations and hop expressions that you seek out in those styles of beers that you make.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that for me personally, and maybe the culture that I've tried to shape at Highland Park Brewery, is that kind of first and foremost, we're a sensory-driven brewery. And so, that sort of sits foundational, is that the more like technical side of things, or you're using ale yeast, or you're using lager yeast, or you're using this science or process, doesn't really matter. What matters is like the end thing in the glass, and whatever you call it, can you communicate that to the consumer to take that thing and enjoy it? That's kind of the bottom line. So for me, it's always kind of starts out as this sensory driven thing. Like, what's the vision for the sensory, and can we achieve that? And so for us as a brewery, utilizing lager yeast to make hoppy beer, we first started making Timbo, I think, in 2015. So that's our West Coast Pilsner, kind of like our flagship beer. It was a mashup of a German Pilsner and a West Coast IPA. We ultimately just really liked the drinking experience and the results. And that led us to manage our yeast utilizing lager yeast. So we were juggling 3 different strains, some sort of hazy yeast strain, some sort of like Chico Cal Ale strain, and then the 3470. And so then to prioritize our yeast management side, sometimes we would sneak in the lager strain for the Cal Ale strain on our IPAs, and nobody knew the difference. If anything, internally, we were like, yep, best batch of, good green ever, best batch of Hello LA ever. And so that was kind of like an internal like secret, probably like 2015 through 2018 or something like that. But the more we were making Timbo, there was, I say we're sensory driven. So there's this practical side for me that's like, okay, what's the flavors we're trying to achieve? How are we like reaching that? And for me, I love the like bright tropical sort of like passion fruit, resinous and citrus peels and that sort of expression. And we were just finding that when we were making hoppy beer with lager yeast, we were getting more of the results that we liked. So, essentially we slowly, that sort of like sneaking in the 3470 lager yeast for our IPAs at one point, I think around 2018, maybe, we just were like, this is dumb. Let's make all of our West Coast hoppy beers with 3470. It's going to streamline our yeast management. Let's just own that. Like, we like this profile. We're not a dogmatic brewery. We're not caught up on like, oh, is it two style? Is it, X, Y, or Z? It's like, what's the flavor we're going for? Can we achieve that? And we got that more with 3470. Seems like there's, at a very, if I was just to like couple like hit points of why we like it. It's like, first, I think that the sulfur interaction with hops gets us those brighter sort of tropical notes. But then the next thing that's maybe even equally as important, and I don't really know the science behind it, but I want hoppy low ABV beers personally. And sometimes with the like ale yeast strains and like Cal Ale, Chico strains, they're a little bit thinner, a little bit lighter bodied, and we were finding with 3470, they were just had a little bit more body, a little more weight to the beer. So we could kind of like load up and saturate the hop presence in the beer, but still have the backbone of structure for the beer. And so those are kind of like the two main things. We were getting a hop expression we liked more, and we were getting the palate experience that we really liked. And, ultimately it was like, had less to do with the like, whatever we labeled the yeast we were using or whatever we labeled the style. It was like, what's our vision for the flavor expression and the palate experience and the overall consumer enjoyment of it. It's a little bit of an uphill battle to communicate that to consumers. It's like I think we compartmentalize things to better understand it. So, we're facing sort of like okay, how do we explain this? What do we communicate? But then once they like have it, it's like, yep, this is what I want. This is like the drinking experience that I want.
Sometimes we in the brewing industry are our own worst enemies, trying to use technical jargon to explain things to consumers. And I think you're right. I think there's this legacy of certain craft brewers trying to drive a wedge between macro lager brewers and creative, crafty ale brewers that we now have to deal with the hangover from that, right? Grant, talk to me about your perspective on this. Obviously you've watched, a lot of brewers. You've, seen it yourself firsthand. And you've also witnessed, lots of brewers embracing this idea of, fermenting hop forward beers, whether those are beers that they sell as lagers or even beers that they sell as IPA or pale ale. From your perspective, describe what you're seeing out there.
Yeah, I think Bob really nailed it. That's definitely the trend these days of seeing more people use like a 3470 or a lager strain in general as kind of more of a house yeast, more of and then making these hoppy beers with it. I think Bob put it perfectly. Lager yeast are a much cleaner profile. They don't have as many like esters as ale yeast. And from that perspective, they kind of get out of the way of hops more so. Maybe you can bring them out more, maybe get a little bit more of a nuance out of them. And yeah, that's just really where I would say that's kind of the directions we're seeing with lager brewing surging in popularity in craft through COVID, like you mentioned earlier. But the kind of the evolution of that is we're seeing lager yeast bleed into other styles, especially ones that perform so well, like 3470. They're just we kind of joke internally, we call it the German stone, because we have this neat study where we look at 3470 over all these different temperature ranges of fermenting the same wort. And the esters and the flavors that it creates don't really change. It just makes a great clean lager beer
consistently across all temperatures.
Yeah, from we say from our study was 12C to 20C. So, yeah.
How do you describe the flavors that yeast produces, especially in conjunction with say more contemporary American hops?
Absolutely, yeah. 3470, I would say, of our lager strains is kind of our most neutral, our most blank canvas. We have some other kind of more expressive strains. Like we actually have a brand new one called E30. We got it from a large and famous Chinese brewery. That's all I can say. But the great thing about E30, and I think BSG just announced they have it for sale August 1st, but so it's now commercially available in the US, but it actually makes isoamyl acetate right at threshold. And so that's not enough to ever be able to drink a lager beer with that particular yeast and say, oh, this is banana. I really think you would have an impossible time trying to differentiate that. But what we see in our sensory testing at Fermentis at our campus is we see that come across as just this just beautiful little sweetness at the end of it. And it's just extremely popular in Southeast Asia and with rice lagers on the rise here in the US, or anyone just looking to differentiate lager strains. It's a really neat one to look into. And then in terms of other expressive lager yeasts that we carry, we also have S189. It comes from a famous kind of now defunct Swiss brewery called Hurlemon. And that one is what I would recommend for anyone looking to bring out hoppy flavors of their lager. It has this and again, when I'm talking about the differences here and what these bring out, don't expect it to be in your face. It's not going to be like a Belgian Abbey yeast that just blows you away with esters. We like those too, but we're talking nuance here in lagers. And S189 has just brings out this nice floralness, accentuates the hops. I believe it actually it has the ability to do a little bit of biotransformation. It makes just a little bit of beta-lyase and can express, can unlock some thiols. And then last but not least, we have S23, which I have a lot of brewers that prefer that one over 3470. I would call it kind of our more maltier strain. S23 is the VLB. So it's the brewing school in Berlin. It's their lager strain, or one of them. And I would say that one is what I would call our malty lager strain. Got some huge fans of that one. See it a lot in Mexican lagers lately. A lot of people finding it success there with it.
That makes sense. So Urs, from some of my reading, you've done work and some experimentation and testing in making hop forward beer using lager yeast, have you not?
Yeah, so actually the work, I didn't do it by myself. It was actually executed by the German Institute. So to people know what they did actually was more investigating which yeast strain, lager strain had the highest beta-lyase activity. And the beta-lyase activity is connected to the biotransformation activity, so to speak. And they were basically checking all of the lager strains, which is not just my grandfather's yeast strains, so all the other yeast strains, all of them outside yeast strains. And the fun part in that was that all of my grandfather's yeast strains were the strains with the highest beta-lyase activity. And that's very interesting. I imagine that these were strains from like the 60s, 50s, or what grandfather collected from different breweries. And then I wanted to use that kind of energy around that. And when I turned 50, I'm an old man. When I turned 53 years ago, I was offered by Bob Beer to create a brew for my birthday. And then I decided, of course, I wanted to do a Pilsner. It had to be lager. Then I wanted to use my grandfather's yeast strain. And then I also wanted to use that. What I learned in the US in all the years is that dry hopping process, but in a different way. And actually what I prefer, the late fermentation dry hop, which is very powerful, impactful. Yeah, and that how that thing happened. No? Unfortunately, we did not bring the beer on the market. It was sort of like I heard over and over again, that is not the time for lager. It is not the time for lager. The people would not buy it. And that is not my decision to make. But it's really a thing that it's great when lager's coming back and there's so much potential to it. And Bob, as you stated, it's also something like you have to understand what you're dealing with, the yeast, the way you treat the yeast, that is the yeast giving you back in a sense. And that way you can do all the different styles with one strain, for example. Anyway, and that was really a great experience with that beer, what we wrote back then with the late fermentation dry hopping. That was really powerful. Also in Germany, they were always trying to add the hop to the whirlpool to preserve the hop aroma. And I was always like, that doesn't really work because you have still the fermentation going, and then all the CO2 is pushing out the hop aroma, what you try to preserve in the whirlpool with the whirlpool hop addition. And the cold dry hopping and storage and all of that is sort of like a little too late. You have no yeast activity. Sometimes you also have more sort of like oxidation as well when you don't use counter pressure and all of the stuff. And then late fermentation, dry hopping, really with the active yeast, helping with the biotransformation, and that is really helping to release the hop aroma to still the higher temperatures and all of this, and bring this type of hop forward beer, number one, with a nice hop aroma, not the bitterness, the focus is on the aroma. And number two, based on the hop variety you use, you get different flavors and types, and that makes it even more interesting. And interestingly, that really my last one, saying that yeast got discovered again the importance of yeast and in conjugation with the hops. So remember, we had just one strain back in the day, just one hop strain in Germany that was really bad. It was like 3470 was just a lone strain, so to speak, or used by 80% of the German breweries, because that was their lame, and the hop varieties, you could see how all the hop varieties went down over the years because the brewers were focusing only on yield, efficiency, and cost savings. And that all changed with the craft brewing revolution in the US, and for what I'm grateful for.
I'm fascinated by this idea of beta-lyase activity and active fermentation, dry hopping with lager yeast, because it seems so weird and fun and counterintuitive to move from, just focusing on hyper clean fermentation and pure expression of hops to then thinking about how even these lager strains can transform and, highlight some of the really pleasing characters in these hops flavors. Bob, I assume you all, have tried or do use these techniques. You want to talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, as I was listening to his talk, I was like, it's so cool how, people can kind of come to the same place. It's like the world is kind of building towards this moment in time. I feel pumped to be a part of it because I really love these beers. And, we essentially do something very similar. It's like we're not, I think when hop creep started to become a known thing, people were trying to figure out what exactly was going on. Beers, I think, were developing more diacetyl. These hop forward dry hop beers were, developing more diacetyl. For me, once we started to get a handle on the diacetyl component of it, the beers themselves started to really come together and the expression started to sing for me. Because I found this really wonderful thing where we dry hop at a fairly stable gravity. Let's say we're at like 4 Plato for a 3.5 Plato for a West Coast Pilsner. There's still fermentable sugar in there. So we harvest our yeast, we dry hop, and it essentially, our process is that we embrace this secondary fermentation and whatever comes along with it. The observation that I have had with that is that the hops stay in suspension. You get this kind of like ongoing churn within the beer. You have active fermentation, and it's keeping them in suspension where, maybe 8, 9, 10 years ago, you would dry hop and you would find yourself having to like rouse the beer to get it up into suspension, and all of the hops would be settling down into the cone, and you would get more vegetative type of expression. And as we started to get hop creep, the beers started like working. The secondary fermentation we were getting started working for us. because we would ferment another Plato. So it would go from, say, 3.5 Plato to 2.5 Plato. And it would keep activity and CO2 kind of like off-gassing to keep those hops in suspension. And I think if you can manage that time where the beer is warm and you're getting that fermentation, you don't extend it out too long, you really capture that brightness of the hops. And for us with the lager yeast, I always bring up this sulfur component because, I like I said, I'm more of a practical brewer and have less of the science background, but I just see this transformation, whether it's sulfur or thiols, that they are less like an ale fermentation, which is like rounder, marmalade-y, kind of richer fruits. And they're more these like tropical passion fruit, guava, higher tone fruits, and citrus zests. And so I think the fermentation for us is more conducive with the hop expression we're trying to get. And so it's cool. Yeah, I think that it's like I said, it's cool hearing Urs talk because I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what we were getting to. We were approaching it very differently, but we were kind of like having the same sort of like secondary fermentation or late fermentation dry hop experience and getting the results that we wanted.
Grant, have you all worked on, and especially with these lager yeast strains, to understand the temperature difference, in how that might affect some of this hop expression? As Bob says, they're warming it up a little bit, at the end there, which would make sense given the, with that dry hop. Or I shouldn't speak for you, Bob. I think that is what you said, right?
Yes, actually, we do. I'll talk in Fahrenheit, but we'll take, say, a West Coast Pilsner from like 54-degree fermentation, and we'll be pushing it to get up to about 65 degrees during the dry hop. So we're looking for those warmer temperatures. We find that that's where we like the expression. The colder dry hopping, we don't tend to like the expression, at least with modern hops. Like I say modern hops, like, the proprietary ones from Pacific Northwest or Southern Hemisphere. It seems like for us, that warmer gets us what we want.
Grant, you have research on dry hop temperature with these lager yeasts?
Yeah. So the thing for everybody to know about Fermentis is we have a beautiful campus that just got built during COVID. It's in northern France. And there we have a pilot brewery, and we have a whole sensory suite with the right partition booths and all of that. So I
was kicking myself because I was just across the border in Belgium back in May. Okay. And I think, we actually drove through the town just because it was the fastest route.
Okay. Yeah, it's right on the border. It's very close to Ghent. It's very close to Brussels.
Poppering, Watu.
Nice central location. Yeah, absolutely. Well, anyways, in the future, come see us. But it's so we're always studying it. We have a bunch. We're always publishing new info. We're always looking at new things. And we have a couple studies. We have some on biotransformation. But I mean, the science is pretty sound, right? Like when you dry hop at a warmer temperature, you're going to get a better extraction. It's just, everything works faster at a warmer temperature, yeast metabolism wise. And so when they make like their beta-lyase to unlock these thiol flavors, they're going to do it faster at a warmer temperature. And they're going to get those, kind of tropical fruit flavors that are sulfur compounds, like Bob was mentioning, like 4-MMP, 3-MH, 3-MH acetate, all those great flavors we're looking for. And again, this is lager brewing, so like they're in a much less quantity. Don't expect something like a GMO yeast will deliver, because that's not what we're after here. We're just looking for like a crushable, crispy lager that has a nice ruby red grapefruit in the finish or something, if that's what you're after. That's how I think of some of these more modern lagers.
Sure. Urs, what's your experience then in, in with this kind of driving flavor and expression, with active fermentation, dry hopping?
Yeah, you have just to think about it again. Like, what does the yeast want? You are basically the brewer house. I don't know, often taking here the brewer out did nothing else than just feeding the yeast, right? So it provided the food, the nutrients, and all of that. So you have to create the food for the yeast or around what you want to achieve with that strain. You have to make sure that we have the kind of work quality with all the precursors, so to speak, which are also very important, right? Because they, in the end, like with phenolic, positive yeast strains, they need the precursor to produce high amount of phenol. That's the same thing with all the other fermentation byproducts. And you have to understand what you're doing in the brew house, what's the mashing all about, to dial in the foundation, the precursor for what you want to achieve. And then come down to fermentation. And I think the bigger thing, what the late fermentation dry hopping actually was, from a practical side of things, how do I get these high temperatures? Because lagers usually are fermenting at low temperatures. So that's usually 52 or 54 degrees Fahrenheit, especially the traditional way. But what a lot of people don't realize really is that all the ester and aroma flavor profile is already dialed in around 30-40% ODF. And that is the point where you can start letting freeze your temperature. And then that where dry hopping should be starting. Where fermentation is slowing down, we don't produce too much CO2 because otherwise you push everything out again, which is not beneficial. And then what's the kind of thinking like, what can we do about it to bring the temperature further up? That was one thing, like figuring out when is the right time, when is my ester profile added in, when can we warm up the temperature. One thing, we have actually a nice system here where we can calculate the ODF based on pressure difference in the tank, and then we know exactly when we have to do the late fermentation dry hopping. So, but then was another thought about that was that the two things looking forward to it. The question number one: how can we bring up the temperature even further? Because that's a kind of inconsistency. Because if you say 40, then it might just go to maybe from 54, maybe 63, 64, but then you are not producing enough heat anymore. And then how can we force it to go higher? And then you want to think about it, can we heat up the fermenter? But everybody will say, you're crazy, you can't heat up the fermenter, But on the small scale, you would be able to do it. It would be simpler if you have a research system, setting something like that up. You can heat the recirculation loop with hot water, and to bring up the temperature. And then number two, that was the other question as well. Do we really need to dry up 100% of the volume, or can we just take a portion out of it and do the dry hopping in there? And if you just do 20% of the volume and heat that portion of the volume up and do the dry hopping in that one, then we have the high temperature and a strong biotransformation, and then you move it back into the main fermenter. So that was sort of like what I'm thinking, or can be positive in that regard.
We're really going to upset the purists now, talking about raising tank temperatures deliberately just to hit dry hop temperatures. Again, we will sidestep all of the philosophical questions around that and just, as Bob says, take it from a sensory perspective and pursue those techniques that serve the ultimate flavor and aroma goals that we're searching for. But I think you did say something interesting there about the timing of ester production and when that tends to get locked into the fermentation. In each of your experiences, what does that timing look like? And at what point do you then become more free to move that temperature in a different direction in order to, achieve, say, your extraction goals or whatnot with that kind of dry hopping?
I'll speak here, and I'll say that. So we use Fermentis 3470, and we were having some. For us, we didn't like the level of acetaldehyde in our beers, and in these dry hop beers, we were just feeling like they were above the threshold that we wanted. We reached out to Fermentis. We kind of gave them all of our parameters, and they were great. They worked with us to develop a better fermentation profile, and part of that was, I'm just going to keep piggybacking on yours because it's working that way. But we started doing our diacetyl rests at about 35% of the way through fermentation. So typically, maybe we ferment for 24 to 48 hours. We hit that 35% of attenuation mark, and then we go into a controlled, not a free rise, but a controlled temperature rise to 65 degrees over, say, the next 72 hours or something like that. Since we've been doing that process, so we probably have been in that process maybe a year and a half, something like that. It completely solved our acetaldehyde issue, and just to piggyback on hers again, it allowed us to be ramping up to that 65 degree temperature earlier, so we could be more guaranteed that we would hit that mark, so that our dry hops were done warmer and we were getting the extraction that we wanted. So yeah, that's our process, and it has worked very well for us. And that, like I said, Fermentis is one of our sort of like vendor partners, and it's I'm not meaning to be like sponsored ad here, but it just it worked out that way that we got their guidance, and it improved our process quite a bit.
Hey, Bob, thanks for the call out. You kind of took the words right out of my mouth. About a third into your attenuation curve is when you can start raising the temperature, is what we would say. And that's because most of your, like Urs said, the point that he made, most of your ester production comes at the beginning of fermentation. It's really just that first part. It's when the yeast are budding and growing. That's when they're creating those esters. And one thing that I would like to add that kind of blew me away from my brewing background, coming to Fermentis, and what we've seen in our studies is that if you go too low of a temperature, you might actually get esters. So, I would say the old way of thinking of brewing is that higher temperatures, higher esters, right? But that's not always true. If you go too cold, you stress out the yeast, you affect how they grow, and you can get spikes of esters, and you can see that in GC and sensory results. So, yeah, I would, just to echo what Bob said, about a third into it, that's when you can start looking at a rise, and again, that speeds up the metabolism of the yeast, and you can get through that acetaldehyde faster, better.
And if I can just add to that, because I love that you just brought up a point that I didn't even know if you go cooler, you could get more esters. I feel like there's a lot of people that are pursuing, say, lager beer or hoppy lager beer or whatever it may be, and they are doing things for traditional for tradition's sake, not based on the actual terrain that they're trying to navigate. And so, you don't end up with that's why I'm like, it should be sensory driven. You should have a vision, and then you should change your variables to achieve that vision. Rather than I ferment for 8 months at 46 degrees.
Yeah, and 19 C. Yeah, 18
I expect to get these results, because it's like, you probably won't get those results. You've got to move the map. Don't do things for tradition's sake. Do them for sensory sake.
Yeah, and and also in our current climate of craft brewing, right? Like, tank time is money. And I love the idea of making a 6 to 8 week long lager. That's romance to me. But do I really have to do that? Do I really have to spend that much time in cooling and tank time? And let's face it, how much beer I can brew in a year, because now I have such a long tank occupancy time, it just doesn't make sense. And so I agree with Bob. Approach it from a sensory perspective.
And I'll say this too, that some of my favorite beers in the world are traditional. And I would almost guarantee you that the reason that they became such wonderful beers is because they were navigating the terrain that they had and the tools that they had, and they got to this place to get this wonderful beer. So I'm not anti-tradition. I'm just pro navigate the resources you have to get to your vision.
Yeah. I know exactly what you mean. When you have some of these, like, if you go to Europe and if you go to Germany and you have some of these beautiful 8-week lagers or something, and they have that little bit of like struck match sulfur. I personally love that, but you need to ask yourself your question as a brewer, as a business owner: is that what I want? Is that what my customers want? Do I need all my beers to be that way, all my lagers, or can I have one on the menu that's that way? There's considerations there.
I have a question for you about, say, tank geometry and hydrostatic pressure, especially as we're talking about esters, fermentation, dry hopping, circulation, extraction. How does tank geometry, volume of fermenting wort, etc., impact this kind of expression within these lager yeasts? And do you manage around that in any particular way?
Yeah, of course, tank geometry, open and closed fermented, big different, big deal, absolutely. But the thing is, the bigger part around ester and how to control it, it's actually we have to control yeast growth. And that needs to be controlled too, because we have to also imagine, I don't know if you know how propagator beer tastes like. If you use the same wort and you propagate it, then we have this very high ester and all that. That's all part of this yeast growth, this yeast propagation thing. And if you think about fermentation, we have yeast growth as well, right? But if you go to high of a temperature and all that, then we have too much yeast growth, and that is not what fermentation is about. So that is more like a necessary thing, like you want to grow enough yeast to get the fermentation finished and then harvest the yeast for the next batch. But if you would be smart and want to keep the ester low, then we have maybe to pitch like 3 times the amount and keep it cold. Then we have all of what you need, and you will be successful with the fermentation. And now when you think about tanks, counter pressure and all of this, what you can actually do it, you can control your yeast growth with counter pressure. And then I have to cite my grandfather because it came actually from him. So actually he went up to, in his breweries back then, he went up to 1.8 bar. And that was about the like 28 psi counter pressure. But it wasn't like just right off the gate, so you have to control it. Your cell count, and at the beginning of the fermentation, we have backly open fermentation, and then you increase the pressure gradually after the yeast duplicates. For example, it goes from, let me say, 50 million at fermenter full, it goes to 30 million. That's where you start increasing the counter pressure. And then when we have the next duplication, and then let me say, you say, I need 60 million cells max, you can adjust that with the counter pressure, and then when it goes past 1.2 bar, then you can really say this is stopping to grow. And you can then, and that is then the good thing in combination with late fermentation, where you can go even with higher fermentation temperature and higher activity for your biotransformation. Yeah? And so that's really the cool thing. And about tank geometry, I mean, you can use open fermenters, that is great. They have, it depends on what type of beer you want to do. And I think there's a preference more for LF styles like wheat beers. And for that regard, open fermenters are more suitable for that. But you can do anything else. You have just to understand the condition you're in and how can I deal with it. You have to make sure that you get the right wort quality coming from the brew house. Make sure you have the right temperature, the right pitch rate. There are so many parameters. So basically, if you look at all the large breweries, they brew the same style at, let me say, 20 different locations, but they all have different brewing equipment, different water qualities and everything. And they're all dialing around with the different parameters to create exactly the same product, like the specs they were given to them. So there's a big flexibility. It's not like, oh, don't use that equipment, no, this doesn't work with that. it would work, but maybe one way a little harder than the other way.
I've got an anecdote for this as well, which we are not talking about the angle of the cones in your tanks if you're using conical fermenters. So, one of our checkpoints is to try to like minimize mercaptan, sort of like, rotting, composting fruit that can be really round and rich and kind of something that we personally don't like. We have 15 barrel tanks, 30 barrel tanks, and then we have one 10 barrel tank. This 10 barrel tank that we added doesn't have as sharp of an angle. So it kind of collects the yeast and the dry hops lower. They don't easily evacuate out of the bottom of the cone. And pretty much every time we brew a hoppy beer in that tank, we get more mercaptan. So we're not readily, we're dry hopping warm. There's still active yeast. And then when the yeast starts to settle, I don't know the exact science, but there's some sort of dynamic between hops and yeast settling in the cone that create mercaptan. And that tank specifically is producing more of that. So that's been sort of a learning lesson in that we've always evacuated our cones on a daily basis when we have hop and yeast interaction. We're trying to sort of like minimize that warm interaction between those in the settled components of that. So, it matters a lot. But once again, we were just sensory experiencing that. And we're like, why are we getting it? And then we realized, the cone is not sharply angled and we're having a harder time evacuating it. And the hoppy beers, we just weren't liking as much out of that tank. So.
And that is so interesting, that is so important for us, the observation on the floor of the people, not of the people sitting in front of a monitor and all this, and not looking at the process closely. Yeah, I'm always like the person who go to the yeast pub almost every day and giving them a hug, talking to them, to the yeast babies, I call them. And, you have to stay in touch, you have to just look at observation, sometimes you capture something and say, hey, why is that beer different? Then you think about the process, the thing about, like your observation with the English thing. Normally, a lot of people, they are just thinking from a functional perspective, but they don't see that how that could benefit the fermentation in the one way or the other. Very cool.
The picture of Urs speaking gently to his yeast babies is going to stay there in my mind now forever.
Or I call them yeast babies. You have to take care of your yeast.
You do.
Must nurture them.
Yeah, I'm curious. I know, Grant, earlier you mentioned new expressive, more focused on expressive, lager yeast strains. Bob, also, have you done any testing? Since 3470 is your workhorse, there are other, tools out there in this lager fermentation world that could give you some different things. Have you experimented with any of these, or have you been trying to learn what they might offer you in the brew house also?
Absolutely. I mean, I think like innovation is so critical and important for us. One of my observations in that is that often there's these advancements in, say, brewing science or process that take bigger leaps. And sometimes it's harder for consumers to like buy into those bigger leaps. So, it's good for us to be sort of experimenting and putting out stuff that speaks to those greater leaps. Let's say thiol yeasts that are like so expressive. It's like, you're drinking beer on another planet, which is great. And it informs what we're going to be doing. But it's these sort of like smaller incremental that are more widely accessible to consumers. That's an important part of the like picture for me. And so, yes, we absolutely experiment with those yeasts, but it's really nice to have this baseline and this calibrating point. And for us, that's 3470. And we can kind of then build off of that. Maybe we change a malt and then we get more thiol expression, or maybe we're adding some sort of new hop product. And that's like one realm where we're taking kind of like baby steps of evolution to adapt to the greater market. And then, we're doing these spikes of these like higher note, higher expression. We recently brewed with the 189. Is that what it's called, Grant?
Yeah, S189. Yep.
Yeah, S189. And we actually replaced it, I think, on a couple batches of Timbo even. And it was great. But it was, once again, as Grant was speaking to it, it's sort of like it's not a thiol yeast. It's small little like tweaks that push it in one direction or the other. So for us, we really like to have that sort of like mindset is you're sort of like evolving your known process for small improvements, and you're taking bigger risks to sort of like make sure you're pushing the envelope a little bit.
As we start to wrap up here, maybe we can finish off with a bigger, broader question, and that is, what are you excited to work on and test now? And where do you think your experimentation is going to lead you next? Are there some avenues of experimentation that you're particularly focused on right now in this space of expressive fermentation and lager yeast? And maybe you can answer that one first, Urs.
It's always the thing, like, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here, because lager fermentation has been around for so long. So now it's more like maybe connecting the two waters, the old water and the new water, together with the findings from like the IPA stuff, and connect that with the lager, traditional lager thing. What I would be thinking of, so yeah, there's nothing new. It had been around for so long. It's just that the craft brewers were, no offense taken, but they were focusing too much on this IPA, this heavy style beers and all this. And now, great that the lagers are coming out now. People get interested in that again. And that the craft brewer now, like with New England IPA, now they take on that challenge. And now they work on creating the best lager, which is awesome. And what I would like looking at would have been, we have to imagine all the famous strains out there nowadays, and all the what Fermentis is providing. We have to think about it like 3470 as a workhorse. It's that can deal with all difficult malt qualities, difficult waters, and all the different harsh environments and all that. That's why actually that strain was shining, because it was very suitable for harsh environments, for wort qualities, malt qualities, and all that stuff. And nowadays, actually, we can go back to before these strains were emerging, of figuring out can we use the old strains that were the predecessor of 3470. That is fair because of that back then, after the Second World War, the malt qualities were poorly and all that, and then certain heat strains were not able to deal with that. And then stronger strains emerged. And then going back to that old strain and maybe give them a try, give them a shot, and see what they are capable of. But I understand as well, fermented can, of course, not do for every strain a dry yeast package. And that is a very convenient for a lot of smaller brewers. If you're capable of doing ordering slants, I will try it from the different yeast banks, try it out and see where I get that for you.
I love the connecting old and new, and such an interesting thing that we can look at innovation as diving back into this history of brewing over the last 100 years and finding new opportunities and new pathways to go down that we may have bypassed at that point, whether it was a consumer's palate's not interested in that, or as you say, that yeast's inability to process the lower quality malt that was there at the time, and so, the brewing industry as a whole has taken certain, pathways based on what it needed to make, decisions at those times, but we can also go back and rethink that and see if there's new options now, given the context we're now in, and maybe follow some of those other pathways. But it is the interest of brewers that drives all of this, that makes it economically viable for folks like Fermentis to go out and do the research and also, do this testing and figure this out. And so it's fun to be in this place where this interest from brewers in this sector of yeast is the highest it's ever been in history. And so, so here we are. So Bob, what are you most interested to experiment with and, test in the next, 6 to 8 months?
I think what draws my interest more and more is fine tuning and perfecting what we already have. It seems like the great leaps of innovation, kind of exhausted consumers. For us, there's less massive draw. And I think as a brewer, that's awesome because I think, I really think of myself as a practical craftsman. And it's this lifelong pursuit to sort of tinker and to achieve the vision, what I'm going for. And I think for beer, for us, I would say, hoppy lagers are something that's defining us as a company. And, as we're trying to pursue making hoppy lagers, you're trying to reduce the noise and have this just pure, bright expression of, say, raw ingredients. And there's, more and more hop products. There's more understanding of yeast and how it relates to fermentation, how it relates to that secondary fermentation. We haven't talked about malt, but malt plays a huge part. Our best hoppy expressive lagers utilize floor malted malts. I don't know what that dynamic is, but those are our favorite beers. And so, for me, it's I'm excited for the innovation that's micro innovation to make a better and better product that the consumer just gets it and they're yep, this is it. This is enjoyable. I love this. And they drink a pint of it, where it's not wow, I had a sip and I'm done. So I'm excited for fine-tuned innovations.
Sure. And I love just dropping those little nuggets right here as we finish. So we can't keep going down those rabbit holes. It's okay. I'm sure we'll talk about that again at some point in the future. Grant, for you all at Fermentis, what's on the horizon? What's exciting you all the most right now? And what?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple things. We field so many questions about spunding, like what Urs was talking about earlier about having CO2 back pressure and can you do that with this strain or that strain or this strain? And, there's not a lot of hard data out there about that. So that's one thing we're really interested in looking into, right? So when you spoon, you actually save a lot of CO2 and, so it is a green practice in and of itself. It's better for breweries. And then, I think it makes a better beer. I think you get a more finer bubbles, just a better more head retention.
Big deal with the finer bubbles that make all the
absolutely. Yeah, it makes a big difference. And so being able to definitively say with data, what spunding does and when you can do it and when you can put it on and what pressure you can do, that's an avenue that I'm really excited that we're looking into. And then also as Urs said, we want to innovate. We want to have more strains, maybe older strains. We want to have them dry. Other lager strains, they're not off the table, right? Yeast drying technology has come a long way, and we continue to refine our processes, and we have to come up with a drying recipe for every new strain we add. So it takes R&D, it takes know-how, it takes a lot of knowledge to pull that off. And so those are what I would say we are most interested in the lager world at Fermentis at the moment. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I think that is a great place to bring this episode to a close. Thanks again for joining me on this special lager fermentation focused episode of the podcast, brought to you interruption free by our friends at Fermentis. Visit fermentis.com for more information on the expressive and the clean lager yeasts that they offer. And of course, their full range of yeasts for lagers and ales. Urs, Grant, Bob, thank you for sharing your thoughts on fermentation and yeast health. It's been great talking to all of you all. Grant, if people want to learn more about Fermentis and the work that you all are doing in lager yeasts, new products, or even as Bob does, is reach out and talk about some of the technical challenges that they're facing and help problem solving. What should folks out there do?
Totally. Yeah, you can get in touch with us through our website. There's basically a portal where you can ask a question. We'll route the traffic to whatever region of the country you're in and or the world, really, of who you want to talk to. But yeah, my personal email, my Fermentis email is g.lawrence, LAWRENCE, at fermentis.lasaf.com. And you can email me, and that's what I'm here for. I love talking beer and technical yeast stuff all day. That's what I do.
Sounds like we should put that that email address and of course URLs in the show notes that anybody listening to it can find an easier one, because that LaSaf has a silent R in it that's going to be impossible for people to
French
actually
words, right? But yeah,
for sure. Anyway, once again, awesome to talk to all of you all about lager fermentation. It's been a real pleasure, and cheers.
Yeah, cheers.
Absolute pleasure.
This podcast has been brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, for those who love to make and drink great beer. To learn more or to subscribe, visit beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.